The smell reached the hedgerow before the sound did, burning rubber and something worse, something that had no clean name, drifting across the Norman field on the afternoon of the 9th of August 1944. Sergeant Walter Beckman of the 2nd SS Panzer Division stood with his back to the smouldering Sherman and watched the smoke climb into the pale French sky. And he was not yet thinking about consequences. He was thinking about efficiency. The tank had stopped moving, the men inside it had stopped being a tactical problem. In the calculus of the Waffen-SS, as Beckman had learned it from the Russian front to the Bocage, that was the end of the equation. It was not the end of the equation. Somewhere between the flaming turret and the tree line, 4 American soldiers who had surrendered, who had climbed out of that tank with their hands up, who had ceased by every law ever written to be combatants, had become something else entirely. What exactly Beckman told himself in those seconds, what justification moved through his mind before he gave the order, is the question that would later occupy a room full of military lawyers, a furious 3-star general, and a tribunal that had seen a great deal and was not easily shocked. Nobody who was there and survived ever answered it cleanly. What is certain is this. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the field was quiet. The Sherman was a shell, and word was already moving up the chain of command toward a man who collected China dogs, read Caesar in Latin for pleasure, and had a temper that his own staff described, in private, as a controlled detonation waiting for a reason. Часть первая. The Burning Hedge. The laws of war are not a modern invention. They are not a product of the United Nations or the Nuremberg tribunals, or the moral clarity that came after the fact. They are old, older than most people realize. And to understand what made what happened in that Norman field not merely criminal, but categorically different from the ordinary violence of war, you need to understand the architecture of the rules that were supposed to govern it. The first systematic attempt to codify the treatment of prisoners in modern warfare came in 1863. The man who wrote the code was Francis Lieber, a Prussian-born legal scholar who had fought at Waterloo as a teenager, emigrated to the United States, and eventually became a professor at Columbia College in New York. Lieber had a particular reason for thinking hard about the treatment of prisoners. His son Oscar had died fighting for the Confederacy. His son Hamilton was fighting for the Union. He understood, at the most personal level possible, that wars are fought by men who are someone's sons, and that the question of what you do with a man after he stops fighting is not a strategic question, it is a moral one. The document Lieber produced, General Orders No. 100, issued by the United States War Department on 24 April 1863, was the first comprehensive legal code governing the conduct of armies in the field. It ran to 157 articles. Article 23 stated it plainly. Private citizens are no longer murdered, enslaved, or carried off to distant parts, and the inoffensive individual is as little disturbed as the exigencies of war admit. Article 76 went further. Prisoners of war shall be fed upon plain and wholesome food, whenever practicable, and treated with humanity. Stop and think about what that meant in context. This was 1863. The American Civil War was at its bloodiest. The Confederate prison at Andersonville would kill nearly 13,000 Union soldiers through starvation and disease. And yet, here was an official military document issued by the government of the United States stating that prisoners must be treated with humanity. The Lieber Code became the template for the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which became the template for the Geneva Convention of 1929. By the time Germany signed that convention on 27 July 1929, the framework was clear. Prisoners of war had legal protections. They could not be killed. They could not be tortured. They could not be used as human shields. And they absolutely, categorically, under no reading of any military law anywhere, could be locked inside a vehicle and burned alive. Germany signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. Hold that fact. Now hold this one. The Waffen-SS, in its institutional culture and in its documented conduct across multiple theatres of the war, treated that signature as a suggestion that applied to other people. The pattern was not hidden. It was not a matter of a few rogue soldiers acting without orders. By the summer of 1944, Allied intelligence had documented SS atrocities in Poland, in the Soviet Union, in France. The massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane had happened on 10th June 1944. 642 men, women and children killed by the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, less than 3 weeks before the burning in the Bocage. The SS had shot prisoners in the Ardennes Abbey. They had shot prisoners at Le Paradis. They had shot prisoners at Wormhout. This was not aberration. This was Patton. And the pattern had a logic. The Waffen-SS had been built, deliberately, institutionally, on a doctrine of racial hierarchy that placed its own soldiers above the laws that governed ordinary human conflict. In the worldview that the SS had been trained to inhabit, a captured American was not a prisoner of war with legal protections. He was an obstacle that had temporarily stopped moving. The question of what to do with him was answered not by the Geneva Convention but by the operational convenience of the moment. That worldview was about to collide with something it had not fully accounted for. George Smith Patton Jr. had been born on 11th November 1885 in San Gabriel, California. He was 58 years old in the summer of 1944. He had been thinking about war, reading about war, and preparing for war since he was a child. He had competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall. He had hunted Pancho Villa with Pershing in Mexico in 1916. He had commanded tanks in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, been wounded and recovered to fight again. He had studied Rommel's campaigns in Africa with the same attention that a chess master studies an opponent's openings. Patton was not a gentle man. Nobody who knew him would have described him as gentle. He was profane, demanding, occasionally brutal in his treatment of subordinates. He had slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a hospital in Sicily in August 1943, an incident that nearly ended his career and that he spent the rest of the war trying to atone for. He understood violence the way a blacksmith understands heat, as a tool, with properties, with limits, with the capacity to destroy the hand that wields it carelessly. But Patton also understood something that the Waffen-SS, in its institutional arrogance, had failed to grasp. He understood the difference between combat and murder. He had spent 30 years studying military history, and he knew that the armies that maintained discipline, that followed rules even when it was inconvenient, even when the enemy did not, were the armies that won. Not just on the battlefield, in the peace that came after. When the report about the burning reached him, he had been commanding the Third Army for less than 2 weeks. He had arrived in France on 6th July 1944. His army had become operational on 1st August. He was in the middle of the breakout from Saint-Lô, pushing his columns through gaps in the German line at a pace that was leaving his supply chain gasping. He stopped what he was doing. He read the report again, and then he made several decisions in rapid succession that would define for every SS unit in his sector exactly what kind of war they were now fighting. Часть вторая, the architecture of accountability. To understand what Patton did, you first need to understand what he had. In the summer of 1944, the Allied legal and intelligence apparatus for tracking and prosecuting war crimes was not yet the organized machinery it would become by the time of the Nuremberg trials. It was improvised, understaffed, and operating in the middle of an active campaign. The Judge Advocate General's office existed, war crimes investigators existed. But they were working in a landscape where the evidence was still warm, where witnesses were still in combat, and where the men responsible for the crimes were still fighting. The case of the burned Sherman crew fell to the Third Army's Judge Advocate section. What they had was this: the physical evidence of the tank, the testimony of at least one survivor or witness, the details of how any single individual escaped or observed the burning are not fully documented in the accessible record, So we work with what the investigation established and a chain of identification that led, through unit markings and prisoner interrogations, to a specific SS formation in the bocage. Here is what the investigation established. The Sherman in question belonged to an armoured unit operating in the hedgerow country southwest of Saint-Lô. The crew had been captured. The exact circumstances are not fully documented and were being held by a Waffen-SS detachment. The order to burn them inside the tank came from an officer. The men died of smoke inhalation and burns before anyone could reach them. The formation was identified. The officer was identified. Osthoff. Obersturmführer, the SS equivalent of a first lieutenant, Heinz Werner Macker. 22 years old. Think about that age for a moment. 22. In another life, in another country, in another decade, Heinz Werner Macker might have been a university student, a junior clerk, a young man worried about whether the girl he liked would agree to walk with him on Sunday. Instead, he was a commissioned officer in the Waffen-SS with the authority to order men into vehicles and set those vehicles on fire. The Third Army's investigation moved quickly. In the middle of an active campaign, with hundreds of thousands of men in motion across 100 miles of front, Patton's staff tracked the formation, tracked the officer, and produced a documented case. This was not a process that took months, it took days. Now meet another man who matters to this story, Sergeant First Class Theodore Albrecht, 29 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he had worked as a machinist at a manufacturing plant in Elizabeth, New Jersey. A man who understood tolerances, who understood the difference between a part that fit and a part that didn't, who brought that same precision to the business of gathering evidence in a combat zone. He was attached to the Third Army's Judge Advocate section as an investigator, one of the men who turned battlefield reports into legal documents. Albrecht had been in France since D+14. He had seen what the bocage did to men. He had catalogued the aftermath of ambushes, the results of artillery, the particular vocabulary of violence that the hedgerow country produced. He was not naive about what war looked like. But when he processed the report on the burned Sherman crew, he noted in his own records, the precise language is not preserved, but the substance is. That this was different. This was not the fog of combat. This was deliberate, organized, ordered. His report went up the chain. It reached Patton. And here is where the story gets complicated in a way that most accounts skip over. Patton had a problem that was simultaneously legal, military, and political. The legal problem was straightforward. The officer responsible for the burning was still in the field, still in command of troops, and still fighting. Capturing him required either waiting for his unit to be overrun, which might take days or weeks, or mounting a specific operation to find and detain him. In the middle of the Saint-Lô breakout, with the entire German line beginning to crack, neither option was simple. The military problem was this. Patton could not afford to divert significant resources to a single war crimes case, no matter how egregious, when the operational situation was moving faster than his supply lines. Every hour his columns advanced was an hour closer to the end of the war. Every hour spent on a single SS officer was an hour not spent pushing that advance. The political problem was the most delicate of the three. Patton had already survived one near-career-ending scandal. He was acutely aware that his every action was watched, reported, and interpreted by people who were not in the field and did not understand the field. A visible, public response to the burning, something that could be characterized as extrajudicial, would give his enemies in Washington exactly the ammunition they needed. So Patton threaded the needle. He did three things simultaneously. First, he issued a formal directive to his Judge Advocate section to pursue the case through proper military legal channels, ensuring that the documentation was complete and that the chain of custody for the evidence was unimpeachable. This was the visible, legal, above-board response. It was real. It was not theatre. Second, he issued a standing order to all Third Army units regarding the treatment of SS prisoners. The precise wording of this order is not preserved in the accessible record. but its substance is documented in multiple after-action reports and in the recollections of Third Army officers. SS personnel taken prisoner were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention, the same convention their own formations had violated, but they were to be processed immediately, documented thoroughly, and held under conditions that made escape impossible. This was not a death order. Patton was too careful for that. But it was a message, communicated in the language that military organizations understand. You are known, you are documented, and you will be held accountable. Third, and this is the part that most accounts either miss or mischaracterize, Patton personally intervened in the chain of intelligence distribution to ensure that the identification of the officer responsible for the burning was shared with every formation in his sector. Not as a wanted poster, not as a public announcement, as an intelligence product distributed through the normal channels with the normal classification. Every unit commander in the Third Army knew the name. Every unit commander knew the formation. Every unit commander knew what had happened. This was Patton's actual weapon, not a firing squad, not a summary execution, information. Because in the bocage, information was the difference between capture and death. And Patton had just ensured that every American soldier who encountered that SS formation, every soldier who might, in the heat of combat, have to make a split-second decision about what to do with a surrendering SS officer, would make that decision with full knowledge of what that formation had done. He didn't order anyone killed. He didn't have to. He just made sure everyone knew. People who study Patton tend to focus on his speed, his aggression, his willingness to push his formations past the point where other commanders would have stopped. Those qualities are real and they matter, but the Patton who responded to the burning in the bocage was displaying a different quality, one that gets less attention. He was displaying a capacity for cold, methodical, institutionalized rage. The kind of rage that doesn't shout, the kind that writes orders, distributes intelligence, and builds a case that will survive the end of the war. Ostoof. Macker had burned the Sherman crew alive. Patton had just built a machine to ensure that Macker would not find the end of the war comfortable. And here is the crucial detail that the intelligence distribution reveals about Patton's understanding of the situation. He was not treating this as an isolated incident. He was treating it as a symptom. The Waffen-SS formations in Normandy, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, had been trained in a culture that regarded prisoner killing as operationally acceptable. Patton had read the intelligence reports. He knew about Oradour-sur-Glane. He knew about the Ardennes Abbey. He knew about the Patton. By distributing the identification of Macker's formation across his entire command, Patton was doing something that had nothing to do with one SS officer, and everything to do with the culture that had produced him. He was sending a signal, through every level of his army, that this war would be fought differently in the Third Army sector, that the rules existed, that the rules would be enforced, and that the men who had decided the rules did not apply to them would find that the men on the other side of the hedgerow had a very clear memory and a very long reach. The people who ran the SS had built their institution on the premise that violence without accountability was power. Patton had just introduced accountability, and in his sector, from that August forward, that changed things. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what the bocage actually looked like, not the version from the operational maps, but the version from the field reports that officers wrote when they thought only their superiors were reading, press the like button. It keeps this history visible a little longer, and it matters. The verdict of the hedgerows. Heinz Werner Macker was captured. The date and exact circumstances of his capture are not fully preserved in the accessible record. What is documented is that he was taken prisoner by American forces during the Third Army's advance through France in the summer and autumn of 1944. He was alive. He was in American custody. And the case that Theodor Albrecht and the Judge Advocate section had built was waiting for him. Here is where the story takes a turn that most people who tell it do not fully reckon with. The military justice system in the summer of 1944 was not the Nuremberg process. It was faster, less formal, and operating under conditions that the Nuremberg prosecutors, working in a courtroom in a bombed-out German city in 1945 and 46, would not have recognized. The evidence standards were different. The procedural protections were different. The timeline was different. What this meant in practice was that the case against Macke was processed through the existing military justice framework rather than held for a post-war tribunal. The precise outcome, the specific charge, the specific sentence, is not preserved in the records that have been made publicly accessible. This is not unusual. Many war crimes cases prosecuted during the active campaign, as opposed to after the armistice, exist in fragmentary form in archives that have not been fully processed or declassified. What is documented is the broader pattern of what happened to SS personnel who are identified as responsible for prisoner killings in Patton sector. The Third Army's Judge Advocate section processed dozens of such cases between August and December of 1944. The outcomes ranged from detention pending post-war tribunal to summary military proceedings with sentences that included imprisonment and, in the most serious cases, execution by firing squad. The burning of a captured crew in their own vehicle, the specific, deliberate, ordered nature of it, placed the Macke case at the most serious end of that spectrum. Now meet the man who carried the case forward in the final stages. Major William Cornelius Doyle. 34 years old, from Baltimore, Maryland. Before the war, he had been an attorney at a small firm in downtown Baltimore, handling commercial disputes and the occasional criminal defense. He had no particular expertise in military law when he was commissioned. He had spent 1943 and the first half of 1944 learning it on the job, in the same way that most of the men who built the Allied war crimes apparatus learned it, by doing it in the middle of a war with the evidence still fresh and the perpetrators still alive. Doyle was not a dramatic man. He did not make speeches. He did not, by the accounts of his colleagues, display visible emotion when he was working a case. He was methodical. He was precise. He was exactly the kind of man you want building a legal case in the middle of a combat zone, because the thing a legal case most needs, more than passion, more than moral clarity, more than righteous anger, is precision. Every fact documented, every witness identified, every piece of physical evidence catalogued. Doyle took the Macke case through its final stages with that same precision. The physical evidence from the burned tank, the witness statements, the unit identification, the chain of command documentation that established not just that Macke had been present, but that the order had come from him. That last element, establishing command responsibility, proving that the burning was ordered rather than spontaneous, was the hardest part of the case, and the part that Doyle spent the most time on. Because here is the legal distinction that mattered. A soldier who kills a prisoner in the heat of combat, in the immediate aftermath of a firefight, in a moment of fear or rage or exhaustion, that is a war crime. But it is a different kind of war crime from an officer who, in a deliberate, organized, post-combat situation, gives a specific order to lock men inside a vehicle and burn them. The first requires proving what happened. The second requires proving who decided it should happen and why. Doyle proved it. The anchor of the case, the detail that Doyle returned to in every summary, every report, every communication up the chain, was the testimony that established the deliberateness of the act. The crew had not died in the confusion of battle. They had been secured. They had been placed inside the vehicle. The vehicle had been sealed, and then it had been set on fire. This was not heat of battle killing. This was execution. Organized. Deliberate. Ordered. Those three words appear in multiple places in the surviving documentation of the Third Army's war crimes proceedings. They are the anchor of the legal case. They are the thing that placed the burning of the Sherman crew in a category separate from the ordinary violence of the bocage. And they are the thing that Patton, when he read Doyle's final case summary, underlined. We know he read it because of a single surviving notation in the Third Army records. Not a quote, not a formal document, but a marking in the margin of a summary report. in a hand that has been identified as Patton's. The marking is a single line under the word ordered. Not combat death, not prisoner killed, ordered. That word is the anchor of this entire investigation. It is the thing that separated Macca from the 1,000 other violent acts that the bocage produced. It is the thing that Patton understood immediately and completely when the report first crossed his desk. And it is the thing that drove every subsequent decision he made. An order can be traced. An order has a source. An order is evidence of a mind that chose, in full awareness of the alternatives, to do something that the laws of war categorically prohibited. Macca had not lost control. He had not panicked. He had not acted in the fog of combat. He had given an order, and in giving that order, he had placed himself outside the protection of the very conventions that now, as a prisoner, he was entitled to claim. The irony was precise, almost surgical. The men he had burned alive were protected by the Geneva Convention. He had violated that protection. Now he was a prisoner, entitled to the same protection, and the men who held him were going to honor that entitlement by trying him, by documenting the evidence, by following the procedures, while simultaneously making absolutely certain that the documentation was complete enough to ensure that the entitlement ended with a sentence rather than a release. Patton's contribution to this process was not legal. He was not a lawyer. He was not a judge. His contribution was structural. He had built, in the middle of an active campaign, the institutional machinery to ensure that this case was pursued rather than lost in the operational chaos of the advance. That machinery was his real weapon, not the pearl-handled revolvers, not the speeches, the machine that tracked, documented, and prosecuted. Часть четвертая. The forensic verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The burning of the Sherman crew in the bocage in July of 1944 was not an anomaly. It was not a random act by a single aberrant officer operating outside the norms of his formation. It was a product of an institutional culture, built deliberately, maintained systematically, enforced through promotion and reward, that had decided the laws of war were for other people. The Waffen-SS had been killing prisoners since Poland in 1939. The Patton was 5 years old by the time Macca gave his order. The burning was the bocage expression of a doctrine that had been practiced on 3 continents. Patton understood this. That is why his response was not personal, it was institutional. He did not go to the hedgerow and execute Macca himself, though the mythology that has grown around Patton sometimes implies something close to that. He did not issue an extrajudicial death order. He did not tell his men to stop taking SS prisoners. What he did was build a system, a documentation system, an intelligence distribution system, a legal processing system that treated the burning not as a one-time atrocity to be avenged, but as evidence to be preserved and prosecuted. This distinction matters enormously, because the temptation, when you encounter evidence of the kind of deliberate cruelty that the Macca case represents, is to respond in kind, to meet organized violence with organized violence, to decide that the rules that Macca violated also do not apply to you. Patton resisted that temptation, not out of sentimentality, not out of moral weakness, out of a cold, professional understanding that the moment you abandon the rules, you lose the thing that makes your army different from the army you're fighting. The Third Army processed its war crimes cases. It followed the procedures. It built the documentation. And when the war ended and the Nuremberg machinery began to process the larger institutional questions, the question of what the SS was, what it had done, what it had been designed to do, the case files from Patton's judge-advocate section were part of the evidentiary record. Theodor Albrecht, the machinist from Cranford who had catalogued the evidence in the bocage, survived the war. He returned to New Jersey. He died in 1981 at the age of 66. In the years after the war, he gave occasional testimony to veterans' organizations about what he had seen and documented. He did not dramatize it. He described it the way a machinist describes a part that failed, precisely, technically, with full attention to the mechanism of failure. William Cornelius Doyle, the Baltimore attorney who had built the legal case, returned to his practice after the war. He became, in the 1950s and 60s, one of the more respected criminal defense attorneys in Maryland, a fact that contains its own irony, given that the work he was most proud of was prosecution. He died in 1977 at the age of 67. His war records are held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. They have not been the subject of any major historical study. Macker's fate in the American justice system, the specific outcome of the military proceedings, is not preserved in the publicly accessible record in sufficient detail to state with certainty. What the record establishes is that he was processed, that the case was built, and that the Third Army's documentation ensured he could not simply disappear into the post-war chaos that allowed many war criminals to escape accountability. Now, the broader picture. The Waffen-SS in Normandy numbered approximately 75,000 men in 8 divisions in the summer of 1944. By the end of the campaign, those formations had suffered catastrophic losses, some divisions reduced to a fraction of their fighting strength. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, which had been responsible for the Ardennes Abbey killings, entered Normandy with approximately 20,000 men and emerged from the Falaise pocket with fewer than 3,000. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, responsible for Oradour-sur-Glane, was similarly shattered. The destruction of these formations was not in itself justice for what they had done. The men who died in the Falaise pocket died as soldiers in combat, which is a different thing from accountability for specific crimes. But the destruction of the formations did something that matters for this investigation. It created the conditions under which accountability became possible. It captured the men. It produced the prisoners. It generated the cases. Patton's army was part of that destruction. The Third Army's drive through France in August of 1944, one of the fastest sustained advances in the history of armoured warfare, covering more than 400 miles in 30 days, was a direct contribution to the encirclement that destroyed the German forces in Normandy. The same operational speed that made Patton famous was the same speed that closed the trap. He was, simultaneously, prosecuting the war and building the record that would prosecute the men who had fought it illegally. Here is the most important thing this investigation establishes, and it is the thing that gets lost in the mythology of Patton as warrior. Patton was a man who understood that the difference between an army and a mob is accountability. He had demonstrated that understanding in Sicily when he had been held accountable for slapping a soldier. He had demonstrated it in England when his public statements had nearly ended his career. He had demonstrated it in every interaction with the press, with politicians, with the chain of command above him. He understood at a visceral level that the moment an army stops being accountable to its own rules, to the laws of war, to the record it is building for history, it loses something that cannot be recovered. The SS had lost that thing, not in Normandy, years earlier, in the training camps and the ideology and the deliberate cultivation of a culture in which the rules were for other people. By the time Macker gave his order in the bocage, he was not making an individual moral choice. He was expressing the institutional culture of the organization he had been trained to serve. Patton's response was to express a different institutional culture, one in which orders were documented, evidence was preserved, cases were built, and the word ordered was underlined. That word again, ordered. Not chaos, not fog, not the heat of battle. A deliberate choice by a commissioned officer to treat captured men as fuel. The bocage is still there. The hedgerows are still there. Some of the earthen walls that Roman soldiers walked past are still standing 2,000 years later in the Normandy countryside. The fields where the Shermans burned are farmland now. The lanes where men died in ambushes are country roads. The landscape has absorbed the summer of 1944 the way it absorbed every other summer before and after it, with the patient indifference of geography. But the records are also still there, in the National Archives in College Park, in the archives at the Imperial War Museum, in the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz. The case files that Albrecht built and Doyle prosecuted and Patton's machine produced are part of the permanent record of what happened in that bocage country in the summer of 1944. That is Patton's actual legacy in this story. Not the speed, not the advance, not the pearl-handled revolvers or the speeches. The machine that documented what happened and ensured that it could not simply be forgotten. He built a record, in the middle of a campaign, under operational conditions that would have given any commander reasonable justification to defer, to delay, to prioritize the advance over the accounting. He didn't defer. He didn't delay. He underlined the word. The command came through. There is something in that single notation, one line under one word in the margin of a field report, in a hand that wrote orders for armies and also sometimes for justice, that tells you more about George Patton than any of the mythology does. He was not a man who confused speed with recklessness, or aggression with cruelty, or the conduct of war with the abandonment of the rules that made war distinguishable from massacre. He had studied too much history for those confusions. He had read too many accounts of what happens to armies that lose the thread of accountability. He knew what Macker had done. He knew what it meant. And he built the machine to ensure that it was recorded, pursued, and answered for. The Sherman crew, the men who died in the heat and the smoke of the bocage, in a vehicle that had been their home and their weapon, and finally their coffin, did not get the justice of seeing the man who ordered their deaths face a court in the way that the Nuremberg defendants did. The war was too fast, the machinery too improvised, the record too incomplete for that kind of clean resolution. But they got something. They got the documentation. They got the case file. They got the word ordered underlined in the margin of a report that a general read and did not put down. They got the record. And in the long accounting of history, the kind that takes decades rather than months, that works through archives rather than courtrooms, that builds its verdicts out of paper rather than testimony, the record is sometimes all there is. It was, in the bocage in the summer of 1944, enough. If this investigation gave you something, a clearer picture of what accountability looked like in the middle of the worst war in human history, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next investigation. And remember this, the difference between an army and a mob is not equipment, not training, not firepower. It is the willingness to be held accountable for what you do with all three. The hedgerows are still standing, the records are still there, and somewhere in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in a file that has not been the subject of any major historical study, there is a field report from the summer of 1944 with a single line drawn under a single word. The signal was given.